Hi, my name is James, and today we're going to discuss Australia's housing assets and compare them from 1988 until 2025 and look at how the housing bubble has massively inflated land values in Australia and caused a massive problem. So for superannuations, we spoke about last time in the last episode how a large share of Australia's superannuations is now being increasingly invested abroad. It's gone up from about 35% in 2013 to about 46% now. And it's a lot because you need these savings that Australia produces to be invested in Australia's infrastructure, such as hospitals, energy plants, roads, so on, to basically fix this productivity issue. If you're going to increasingly bring in migration to Australia, you don't need to bring up the existing capital or infrastructure to handle this migration. Otherwise, you get detachment, as we're seeing here, with productivity going down and real GDP going up, built on migration. And the simple solution we discussed last episode was basically capping overseas investment and reallocating this into Australian infrastructure investments. So that's a simple fix for Australia's superannuation, but the real issue is actually our land issue, because Australia's land is finite, it's a small amount of it, and a lot of Australians since 1988 have taken out huge loans with their savings and invested in real estate, basically betting on the land going up. If you see here, the dwelling as a value of Australia's assets has actually increased its share. It's gone from 23% in 1988 to 14%, and land's gone to about 42%. That's because there's a finite supply of quality land in Australia that you can actually get a good return on investment, and everyone takes out huge loans to bet on it. The people that actually live in these areas don't want to change the laws because, let's think about it, if all your wealth's tied up in real estate or in land that you live on, you don't want to subdivide it, you don't want to change it in any way, you want people to increasingly take out huge loans and bid on this land. And it's a massive problem for productivity because land is non-productive. You're not producing any more stuff or any more goods and services. And so what needed to happen basically back in 1988 was a land value tax to discourage land price speculation. Because every Australian citizen goes to the bank now, gets a huge mortgage to go basically gamble on land and bet on that goes up, this needed to be discouraged. Instead, the Australian government throughout the 1980s, 2000s, and basically ever since, has basically thrown money at it. They've basically put subsidies in place that people do actually take their savings to the bank, go out and then get a huge mortgage and gamble on land price appreciation. And the problem is it causes huge distortions and kills Australia's productivity. And you can see the most recent policy is basically this health buy scheme where you only need a 2% deposit, and the Australian government will contribute about 30% to an existing, 40% to a new. And what this does, it further causes stimulation to the Australian housing market and misallocates capital into non-productive assets. And the problem is, if you want to put a land value tax now and address this huge speculation, the problem's even more massive. So now 42% of Australia's housing assets are concentrated in land. So you kill land, the value of land, well then people are going to come back to their consumption and you're going to have a huge tank in GDP, which makes it very politically unpopular to do so, to even fix the situation because you're just going to get voted out. And if we were to quantify how much exactly this is, these subsidies, it's about $111 billion if we look at just the main ones from the federal government to Australian property investors and homeowners. This is about 3.5% of Australia's GDP, and it's absolutely enormous. The people benefiting from this are about the 35 to 65-year-olds, and it's increasingly to the top 1% or top 10% of Australian households. And you can see here, even for capital gains tax discounts for real estate, it's all to the elderly people in Australia and to the highest income earners, causing huge wealth disparity. And another even bigger problem is the fact that Australia skews towards a direct taxation system. Basically, we rely heavily on personal income tax to finance these subsidies to property investors and homeowners, rather than using a land value tax that we could use basically a 1% tax on all land in Australia to then pay these bills. So the big problem is now that we have people that are the poorest who are working being taxed very heavily to finance subsidies for the richest, who are the homeowners and property investors in Australia. And Australia largely got away with this housing price speculation or land price speculation because interest rates fell. Interest rates fell from about 17% all the way down to 0% in 2022, and this allowed cheaper mortgages and then larger house prices by effect. What you can see here is this reversal. So there's a big problem when you have a huge household debt to GDP. If all of a sudden the interest burdens on all these mortgages start skyrocketing, people have to cut back consumption and increasingly have to pay down their mortgage, which is basically very bad for the Australian economy because it relies on household consumption. Additionally, Australia has 95% of their mortgages in variable rate or adjustable rate mortgages. So any interest rate hike is going to have an immediate effect on households and causing them to cut back spending and pay more into interest payments. And as we can see here, since the interest rate hikes, huge flows into Australian mortgages, basically people paying down their mortgages to cut down their interest expense. This leads to a decrease in household consumption and a contraction in GDP, or a reduction in GDP growth. As you can see here too, a huge problem with the capital misallocation into housing is the home ownership rates. Home ownership rates for 25 to 29-year-olds have fallen from 54% in 1976 to 36% in 2021, and you can imagine are even lower now, probably about 33% for 25 to 29-year-olds. And this has a massive impact on Australia's fertility rate. As we can see here from the 1960s, it's fallen all the way down to about 1.5. So Australia's birth rate is basically fallen off a cliff, and going to lead to a huge aging population in the future. Finally, to conclude, how do we actually fix the house price speculation or land price speculation in Australia? Well, there's no easy task. Unlike superannuation, where we could just redirect Australian superannuation from being invested abroad to being invested in Australian infrastructure projects, fixing Australian land price speculation is a lot more difficult because 42% of Australian household assets are tied up in land. So if you start putting a land value tax in place to discourage land investment, well, people who have their wealth in this aren't going to vote for it, number one. And number two, they're going to lose wealth. So they're going to cut back spending, which is household consumption is about 55% of Australia's GDP. So you're going to have a massive contraction in GDP. So short-term, severe pain for any change in policy now. Whereas back in 1988, when it was only about 30% of Australia's household assets, you could get away with the land value tax because then basically people would stop investing in real estate. You wouldn't have this huge household debt to GDP of 110%, and you could deal with the problem.